host of this boring yet cosy sleep story. In tonight's story, we meet Thomas, who is spending a rainy week in his cabin in the woods. Settle down, get cozy, and get ready to drift off into a peaceful sleep. The rainy cabin. The rain had already begun to fall by the time Thomas reached the cabin. It came softly at first, pattering against the leaves, sliding down the wooden shingles of the roof in thin, glistening lines. His boots left faint impressions in the damp earth as he made his way up the narrow path, its stones slick with moss. He paused for a moment at the edge of the porch, breathing in the cool, rain-soaked air. The cabin stood quiet and still, its wooden beams darkened by the dampness. The small window beside the door fogged slightly from the warmth inside. He reached out, turned the key, and stepped over the threshold. The scent of cedar and old wood greeted him, familiar and comforting. He set his bag down by the door, shrugged off his coat, and hung it on the wooden peg beside the stove. The cabin was exactly as he'd left it. Simple, quiet, untouched by the passage of time. Thomas moved slowly through the space, his footsteps soft against the worn wooden floor. He checked the small stone hearth first, running his hand over the iron grate, brushing away the thin layer of ash from the last fire. He opened the small iron door, placed 2 thick logs inside, and struck a match. The flame caught quickly, crackling softly as it grew, licking at the bark with gentle persistence. The rain tapped steadily against the windows, blurring the view outside, turning the forest into soft patches of green and grey. Thomas watched it for a moment, his hand resting on the back of the rocking chair near the hearth. He gave it a gentle push, listening to the familiar creak of wood against wood as it swayed back and forth. The fire grew steadily, flames curling around the logs and casting a warm, flickering glow across the room. Thomas watched for a moment, listening to the gentle crackle as the bark split and curled away, revealing glowing embers beneath. He rubbed his hands together slowly, feeling the warmth spread through his palms before moving to the small kitchen, tucked neatly into the corner of the cabin. The rain continued its steady rhythm, pattering against the roof and sliding down the windows in thin, glistening trails. It blurred the world outside into muted shades of green and grey, softening the edges of the trees and turning the path into a meandering ribbon of wet stones. Thomas filled the kettle from the rain barrel just outside the back door, his hands brushing away the few stray leaves that had gathered around the lid. The water was cool and clear, droplets slipping from the rim as he carried it back inside and set it on the iron stove. The room smelled faintly of cedar and ash, the familiar scents of the cabin mixing with the dampness that clung to his coat. He reached up to the wooden shelf that hung just above the countertop, his fingertips grazing the jars that lined its surface. Dried herbs, bits of wild flowers tied in bundles, and glass jars filled with tea leaves were arranged neatly, their labels written in his own careful hand. He chose the tin of black tea, its surface dented and worn, and spooned out a portion into the small metal strainer that hung beside it. He waited as the kettle began to steam, the faint whistle rising and filling the room with a soft hum. The rain grew heavier, drumming more insistently against the roof, spilling from the edges in quick, delicate streams that pooled on the ground beneath. Thomas watched from the window as the drops collected along the porch railing, gathering in fat, trembling beads before sliding off in quick succession. When the water was ready, he poured it slowly over the tea, the steam curling up and fogging the glass panes beside him. spread through his fingers, then carried it back to the rocking chair by the fire. The chair creaked softly as he settled into it, his body leaning back into the familiar curve of the wooden frame. Outside, the rain fell steadily, its rhythm unchanging, a soft percussion that filled the silence. He took a slow sip, the warmth of the tea spreading through his chest, mingling with the heat from the fire. He let his gaze drift around the room, taking in the familiar comforts that surrounded him. The heavy woolen blanket folded neatly at the end of the worn leather sofa, the small stack of books resting on the shelf by the window, their spines cracked and faded from years of gentle reading. On the far wall, a row of tools hung in careful order, his grandfather's hammer, the rusted spade he had found at a yard sale years ago, the wooden-handled axe that still bore the nicks and scratches of hard winters. Thomas rocked gently, the chair creaking in slow, rhythmic protest with each movement. The fire crackled softly, sending thin trails of smoke curling up toward the stone chimney. He watched as the flames danced, licking at the bark, sending sparks spiraling up and disappearing into the shadows above. A breeze slipped through the crack in the window frame, stirring the edges of the curtains and carrying with it the faint scent of rain-soaked pine. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing it in, letting the calmness settle over him. There was nowhere to be, no pressing demands, just the rain, the fire, and the slow, unhurried pace of the day stretching out before him. His thoughts wandered as he rocked, drifting in and out of familiar memories. Long summer afternoons spent by the riverbank, the sound of cicadas buzzing in the tall grass, the feel of sunlight on his back as he worked the garden soil with his hands. He remembered rainy days like this too, the kind that stretched for days, unyielding and constant, turning the path to mud and leaving the cabin smelling of cedars and damp earth. The rain continued, unbroken, slipping from the eaves in soft winding trails. He listened to the rhythm of it, each drop finding its place among the stones and leaves outside. A faint breeze swept through the trees, shaking loose a fresh wave of droplets that pattered softly against the window pane. The fire popped and crackled, sending a faint shower of sparks toward the grate. Thomas reached for the iron poker, stirring the logs gently, coaxing the flames to burn a little brighter. He added another log from the stack beside the hearth, brushing the stray bits of bark from his hands before settling back into the chair. Mast took another slow sip of his tea, his eyes drifting back to the window. The mist hung low over the treetops, weaving between the branches and settling into the hollows of the forest floor. It was quiet, impossibly still. The world softened and then blurred by the rain. The clock on the wall ticked softly, its hands moving in slow, deliberate circles. Time moved differently out here, measured more by the rise and fall of the fire, the soft patter of rain, and the shifting light that crept through the windows as the day unfolded. Thomas let out a slow breath, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease as the warmth from the fire settled into his bones. There was nowhere to be, nothing that required his attention, only the gentle stretch of hours, unhurried and uninterrupted, softened by the rain that continued to fall with quiet persistence. The rain showed no sign of letting up. If anything, it seemed to settle into its rhythm with greater insistence, tapping more steadily against the windows and trailing down the roof in thin, glistening lines. Thomas leaned back in the rocking inches, heavy and trembling, before slipping quietly to the ground below. Pools of rainwater collected at the base of the path, reflecting the pale light of the overcast sky. The fire burned, low, crackling softly, its flames curling around the fresh log he had added earlier. Thomas rocked gently, the chair creaking in quiet protest, the sound rhythmic and steady. His gaze lingered on the window pane, where droplets trace slow, meandering paths down the glass, merging with one another before slipping out of sight. Eventually, he set the empty mug on the small wooden table beside him and stood, stretching his arms over his head and feeling the pull of sleep loosen its grip on his muscles. The cabin was warm now, the dampness chased away by the steady crackle of the fire. He moved unhurriedly to the small wooden cabinet near the door, pulling it open to reveal a neat collection of tools and bits of wire. He chose a small screwdriver and a tin of oil, tucking them under his arm before reaching for the old brass clock that hung beside the kitchen shelf. It had belonged to his grandfather, his face scratched and faded, the hands moving with a slow, deliberate tick that seemed to echo through the room. Lately, it had developed a faint hitch in its rhythm, a subtle lag that had grown more pronounced with each passing week. Thomas set it gently on the table, brushing away the thin layer of dust that had gathered on its surface. He pulled up a chair, the legs scraping faintly against the wooden floor, and sat down, his hands resting on the worn brass casing. Outside, the rain continued to fall, slipping from the edges of the roof in long, unbroken streams, pooling along the stones of the path. He unscrewed the back of the clock with slow, careful movements, setting each tiny screw in a neat line along the edge of the table. The interior of the clock was familiar to him, its gears and springs intertwined in delicate patterns, their edges polished and smooth. He dabbed a bit of oil onto the moving parts, watching as the gears clicked gently into place, moving with a smoother rhythm than before. Thomas wiped his hands on a clean cloth, the faint scent of metal and oil lingering on his fingertips. He turned the hands gently, listening as the clock ticked in perfect time, the hitch smoothed away by the careful work of his hands. Satisfied, he reassembled the back, screwing it into place with the same deliberate care. The fire crackled softly behind him, sending thin trails of smoke curling up toward the chimney. He glanced over his shoulder, noting the way the flames licked at the edges of the logs, sending faint shadows dancing along the walls. He stood, the clock cradled carefully in his hands, and returned it to its place on the wall. The rain drummed steadily against the roof, its rhythm unchanged, unhurried. He stepped back and listened to the gentle tick of the clock, its sound steady and strong, blending seamlessly with the patter of rain outside. A sense of satisfaction settled over him, a quiet contentment that came from work done well and unhurried. The afternoon unfolded gently. Thomas moved through the cabin with the ease of long familiarity, his hands brushing over the edges of shelves and countertops, feeling the smoothness of the wood beneath his fingertips. He tidied the workbench near the window, coiling stray bits of twine and straightening the jars of nails and screws that lined the back edge. He wiped the surface clean with a damp cloth, brushing away the fine layer of dust that had gathered there. Outside, the rain continued, blurring the landscape into soft, muted colours. He paused now and then to watch it, his eyes following the paths of droplets as they slipped down the leaves and gathered in shallow puddles ripples that rippled with each new splash. The forest was hushed beneath the weight of the water, its edges softened and blurred, the birds silent in the heavy branches. Thomas filled the kettle again, setting it to boil on the iron stove, the water sloshing softly against the sides. As he poured, he moved to the pantry, pulling open the wooden door and reaching for the jar of dried beans he had stored there months ago. He measured them out slowly, pouring them into a small pot and adding water before setting it on the back of the stove to simmer. The smell of wood smoke and damp earth filled the cabin, mingling with the faint scent of rain that slipped in through the crack beneath the door. He sliced an onion, his knife moving with practiced precision, the pieces falling neatly onto the cutting board. Carrots and potatoes followed, their skins rough and familiar beneath his hands. He added them to the pot with a pinch of salt and stirred slowly, watching as the water bubbled up around the edges, steam curling gently toward the ceiling. He worked without hurry, his movements slow and deliberate. There was no rush, no need for anything beyond the simple rhythm of the tasks before him. The rain continued its steady cadence against the windows, softening the light that filtered through the glass, turning the room into a soft patchwork of shadow and warmth. When the stew was finished, Thomas ladled a portion into a bowl and carried it to the small wooden table by the window. He sat down, the chair creaking softly beneath him, and watched the rain slip down the glass as he ate. Each spoonful was unhurried, the warmth of the broth spreading through him, easing the last traces of chill from his bones. The world outside blurred and softened, the rain falling in gentle sheets, pooling along the path and winding its way down the stones. He watched the ripples dance across the surface of the puddles, the circles spreading outward before disappearing into the soft edges of the grass. The rain continued its soft, unhurried descent as the afternoon gave way to evening. The light outside grew dimmer, the mist thickening as it settled over the treetops, weaving between the branches and curling along the forest floor. Thomas sat at the small wooden table by the window, the empty bowl resting in front of him, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since cooled. He watched as the rain fell in steady streams from the edge of the porch, pooling along the stones and winding down the gentle slope toward the creek. The world outside was blurred and softened, the trees fading into patches of grey and green, their outlines hidden behind thin sheets of water that streaked the glass. Droplets clung to the tips of pine needles, gathering until they trembled and fell, sending ripples across the puddles below. He watched them, his eyes tracing the path of each drop as it slipped silently to the earth. After a while, Thomas set his mug down and stood, stretching his arms above his head and feeling the pull of the day settle into his shoulders. He moved to the hearth, adding another log to the fire, nudging it with the iron poker until the flames licked eagerly at the fresh wood. The warmth spread slowly through the room, softening the edges of the shadows that had begun to gather in the corners. He crossed the room to the small wooden cabinet near the door, pulling it open to reveal a row of neatly arranged oil lamps. Their glass chimneys gleamed faintly in the dim light, polished and clear. He took one down carefully, brushing his hand along its surface to clear away the thin layer of dust that had gathered there. Thomas set it on the table and reached for the small tin of lamp oil that sat on the shelf above. He poured it slowly, watching as the oil slipped smoothly into the base, filling it nearly to the top. He trimmed the wick with practiced hands, went slow and deliberate and struck a match against the side of the tin. The flame caught with a soft hiss, spreading across the wick and sending a gentle glow through the glass chimney. He adjusted the flame, turning the knob until the light grew steady and bright, casting long, flickering shadows along the walls. He set the lamp on the mantel above the hearth, its light stretching out across the room, filling it with warmth and softness. The rain drummed quietly against the windows, slipping from the eaves and trailing down the panes in thin, meandering paths. He listened to it for a long while, his hands resting on the back of the rocking chair near the fire, the soft creak of the wooden floorboards beneath him, blending with the rhythm of the rain. Thomas moved back to the kitchen, his steps slow and unhurried, and filled the kettle once again from the rain barrel just outside the back door. He listened to the gentle splash of water against the metal, droplets slipping from the edge and scattering on the ground beneath his feet. He carried it back inside, set it on the stove, and lit the burner with a match, watching as the flame curled and flickered beneath the iron. The cabin was warm and quiet, the only sounds the faint ticking of the clock on the far wall and the steady whisper of rain that filled the spaces between. He reached for the tin of tea leaves, pried off the lid, and spooned a bit into the strainer. His hands moved with the ease of long familiarity, each task unfolding slowly, unhurried and precise. While the water came to a boil, Thomas wandered back to the window, his hand resting on the edge of the frame. Outside, the world had grown darker, the shadows deepening beneath the canopy of trees, their outlines softened by the steady mist that hung low over the ground. The rain had gathered into small streams that wound their way through the underbrush, slipping over rocks and around the thick roots that pushed up from the earth. He watched as the droplets traced paths down the window pane, merging and splitting, winding their way toward the bottom before disappearing from view. The rhythm of it was hypnotic, a gentle lull that stretched across the landscape, smoothing away the roughness of the forest and turning it into something softer, quieter. The kettle began to whistle, a thin curl of steam slipping from the spout and winding its way into the air. Thomas moved back to the stove, turning off the burner and pouring the water carefully over the tea leaves. The scent rose up immediately, warm and earthy, filling the small kitchen with the soft smell of bergamot and cedar. He carried the cup back to the rocking chair by the fire, settling into it with a slow sigh. The chair creaked softly as he leaned back, his hands wrapped around the warm ceramic, the steam drifting up and fogging his glasses slightly. He took a slow sip, the warmth spreading through his chest, easing the last traces of chill from his bones. The fire burned steadily, casting flickering patterns across the walls, its glow stretching out across the braided rug that lay in the centre of the room. Shadows danced along the wooden floorboards, swaying in time with the flames that curled and crackled behind the iron grate. Thomas rocked gently, the chair moving back and forth with a soft rhythmic creak. Outside, the rain showed no sign of stopping, its pace unhurried, constant. He listened to it, his eyes drifting close for a moment as he let the sound settle over him. There was peace in it, a softness that seemed to wrap around the cabin, holding everything in quiet suspension. The light from the oil lamp glowed softly, stretching its warmth across the room, casting long shadows that flickered gently with each shift of the flames. The rain tapped against the windows, slipping from the eaves and pooling along the his gaze drifting to the window, watching as the rain continued its unhurried descent. The hours stretched out in long, unbroken lines, the rain falling steadily, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. He watched as the shadows grew deeper, stretching out across the floorboards, their edges softened by the flickering light. Outside, the mist hung low, weaving between the trees, settling into the hollows of the forest floor. The rain showed no sign of stopping as the evening settled gently over the cabin. The light outside had faded to a soft grey, shadows stretching long and low across the forest floor, blending seamlessly with the mist that clung stubbornly to the tree line. Thomas stood slowly from his chair by the fire, his joints stiff from the hours spent in quiet reflection. He set his empty mug on the small wooden table beside him, his fingers brushing against the smooth surface before he moved toward the kitchen. The lantern on the mantel flickered softly, its glow stretching across the room in warm, familiar patterns. Outside, the rain drummed a steady rhythm against the roof, slipping from the edges of the porch in long silver trails. Thomas struck a match, the tip flaring bright for an instant before settling into a warm, steady flame. He touched it to the wick of another oil lamp that hung above the countertop, the glass chimney fogging slightly as the light bloomed, the kitchen filled with a soft warmth, shadows shifting gently as the flame flickered and steadied. He moved to the pantry, its wooden door creaking faintly as he pulled it open. Shelves lined with glass jars stretched before him, each filled neatly with dried beans, rice, and bits of herbs tied with twine. He ran his hand along the edges of the jars, feeling the coolness of the glass beneath his fingertips, before selecting a jar of lentils and a smaller one filled with barley. He set the jars on the counter and reached for the heavy iron pot that hung beside the stove, its surface blackened from years of steady use. He filled it halfway with water from the rain barrel outside, the liquid splashing cool and clear into the pot, before he set it on the stove and struck a match to light the burner beneath it. The flame caught quickly, curling blue and steady, sending faint waves of heat radiating up from the surface. Thomas measured out the lentils and barley with unhurried precision, his hands moving with the ease of long familiarity. He added them to the pot, watching as they sank slowly into the water, swirling in gentle circles before settling to the bottom. He reached for the shelf above the stove, taking down a bundle of dried thyme and a small jar of salt. He sprinkled a bit of each into the pot, the herbs spreading out in soft spirals, colouring the water with flecks of green. The rain continued to tap steadily against the windows, its rhythm unbroken, soothing in its constancy. He leaned against the countertop for a moment, listening as the water began to bubble softly, steam curling up and fogging the glass panes nearby. Outside, the forest was blurred by mist, the trees fading into shadows, their branches dripping with moisture that slipped in thin rivulets to the earth below. Thomas reached for the cutting board that hung from a hook beside the stove, its surface worn smooth from years of careful use. He set it down gently, the wood thumping softly against the countertop, and reached for the small basket of vegetables that sat beside the pantry. He chose 2 carrots, their skins still slightly rough with dirt, and a handful of potatoes, their surfaces cool and firm beneath his hands. He moved slowly, his knife gliding through the vegetables with practiced ease. The carrots fell away in even slices, the blade tapping softly scent of thyme and simmering broth, the air growing warmer as the stew began to bubble. In earnest, he swept the vegetables into the pot, their edges softening almost immediately, tiny bubbles rising to the surface in slow, deliberate bursts. He stirred the mixture with a wooden spoon, watching as the lentils began to break down, thickening the broth, turning it rich and fragrant. Outside, the rain grew heavier, its rhythm deepening, the drops slipping from the roof in long, unbroken streams. Thomas moved to the window, wiping the fog from the glass with the side of his hand, his fingertips leaving faint trails along the surface. The view beyond was softened, blurred into gentle patches of green and grey, the rain pooling along the edge of the stones that lined the path. He watched for a long moment, his eyes tracing the winding paths the droplets made as they slid down the leaves and splashed into the puddles below. The forest seemed to breathe beneath the weight of the water, its branches sagging slightly under the dampness, leaves shimmering with droplets that caught the pale light from the cabin. Thomas stepped back from the window, turning his attention back to the stove. The stew had thickened nicely, its surface simmering with small ripples, steam curling up and fogging the window behind it. He reached for a wooden bowl from the shelf above the counter, its edges worn smooth from years of use, and ladled a generous portion into it. The broth sloshed gently, settling as he set it on the wooden table near the fire. He cut a slice of bread from the loaf he had baked the day before, its crust still firm, its centre soft and airy. He set it on a plate beside the bowl and poured himself a fresh cup of tea, the steam curling up in soft spirals as it settled into the mug. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the roof, filling the cabin with its quiet percussion. Thomas pulled out the chair, its legs scraping faintly against the wooden floor, and settled into it, his hands wrapping around the bowl, feeling its warmth spread through his palms. He ate slowly, his movements unhurried, savouring each bite, the taste of thyme and barley spreading across his tongue, rich and comforting. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its flames casting flickering patterns along the walls, stretching out across the braided rug that lay beneath his feet. Outside, the rain drummed on, its rhythm steady and soft, slipping from leaf to leaf, pooling in the hollows of the stones that lined the path. He took his time, chewing slowly, the warmth of the stew spreading through him, easing the last traces of chill from his bones. When he had finished, he leaned back in his chair, the wooden frame creaking softly beneath him. He listened to the rain, his eyes drifting back to the window where droplets continued their slow, winding paths down the glass. The room had grown warmer, the fire casting long, flickering shadows that danced along the walls, mingling with the soft glow of the lantern that hung above the kitchen shelf. He watched as the flames licked at the edges of the logs, sending faint tendrils of smoke curling up toward the stone chimney. Thomas sat quietly for a long while after finishing his meal, his hands resting gently on the wooden table, fingers tracing the smooth grain as he listened to the rain whisper against the windows. Outside, the light had faded into the soft shadows of evening, the trees now only silhouettes against the grey curtain of mist that wove its way through the forest. The rain continued to fall steadily, pattering against the roof and spilling from the eaves in long, shimmering trails. He stood slowly, stretching his back as the chair creaked beneath him. His footsteps were soft against the wooden floor as he carried his bowl and spoon to the small sink tucked in the corner of the kitchen. still and quiet, the air heavy with the scent of cedar and simmered broth. Thomas moved slowly through the room, his hands brushing over the backs of chairs, fingertips trailing along the edges of shelves lined with small glass jars of dried herbs and spices. He paused by the mantel, reaching for the matches that sat in a small wooden box, their edges worn smooth from handling. The oil lamp near the window had dimmed, its light flickering faintly as the oil began to burn low. He lifted the glass chimney carefully, setting it aside before trimming the wick with practiced hands. The flame wavered for a moment, then steadied, casting a soft, warm glow across the room. He poured a bit more oil into the base, replaced the chimney, and watched as the light brightened, stretching out across the floor in long, gentle lines. Satisfied, Thomas moved to the bookshelf that stood against the far wall, its surface cluttered with leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked and faded from years of gentle reading. He ran his hand along the edges, his fingertips brushing over the embossed titles until he settled on an old favourite, its cover soft and familiar beneath his touch. He carried the book back to the rocking chair by the fire, its wooden frame creaking softly as he settled into it. The flames danced in the hearth, sending thin tendrils of smoke curling up the chimney, filling the room with a gentle warmth that chased away the last traces of dampness. He pulled the woolen blanket from the back of the chair, draping it over his lap, its weight settling around him in familiar comfort. Outside, the rain continued its soft, unhurried rhythm, slipping from leaf to leaf, pooling along the edges of the path, gathering in shallow puddles that rippled with each new drop. The sound of it blended seamlessly with the crackle of the fire, filling the cabin with a quiet stillness that wrapped around him like the folds of the blanket. Thomas opened the book slowly, his pages whispering softly as he turned them, his eyes settling on the familiar words. He read quietly, his gaze moving steadily across the lines, each sentence unfolding with the slow, deliberate pace that matched the rain outside. He read not to pass the time, but to settle into it, to stretch out the quiet moments, to let them fill the spaces between the firelight and the rain. The light from the lantern glowed softly, stretching across the room, casting long shadows that wavered and swayed with the flicker of the flames. Outside, the rain thickened, its rhythm deepening, droplets tapping more insistently against the window panes. The trees bent slightly under the weight of the water, their branches swaying with the breeze that slipped through the canopy. After a while, Thomas closed the book gently, setting it on the small wooden table beside him. He leaned back in the rocking chair, his hands resting on the worn wooden arms, and listened to the rain. It drummed against the roof in slow, rhythmic waves, pooling along the edge of the porch before spilling over in quick, delicate streams. He watched as droplets traced paths down the glass, meandering in thin, trembling lines before slipping out of sight. The fire burned low, its flames settling into soft, steady embers that glowed faintly in the grate. Thomas stood slowly, stretching, his arms above his head and feeling the pull of the day settle into his bones. He moved to the hearth, added another log from the stack beside it, and nudged it into place with the iron poker. The flames caught eagerly, licking at the fresh wood, sending faint sparks spiralling up the chimney. He lit 2 more lanterns, their light stretching out into the corners of the room, softening the shadows that lingered there. The room filled outside, unbroken and unhurried. Thomas moved to the window, his hand resting on the sill as he peered out into the darkness. The view was softened by mist and rain, the path blurred into faint outlines, the trees stretching up into shadows that disappeared into the grey. He watched for a moment, listening to the steady patter of droplets slipping from branch to branch, pooling in small rivulets that wound their way toward the creek. Thomas drew the heavy curtains across the window, their edges brushing softly against the floor as they settled into place. He moved through the cabin, drawing the curtains closed over each window, the fabric thick and warm, muffling the edges of the sound, but never quite covering it. The rain was constant, slipping through the quiet like a familiar song. He stepped back to the fire, nudging the logs once more, and watching as the flames crackled and curled. Satisfied, he reached for the small tin of tea that sat on the shelf above the stove, spooning a bit into the strainer and setting it inside his mug. He filled the kettle from the rain barrel once more, its surface rippling with droplets as he carried it inside and set it to boil. The light from the lanterns glowed warmly, casting long shadows that swayed gently with each flicker of the flame. Outside, the rain fell in steady sheets, slipping down the roof, pooling along the edges of the path, winding its way down to the creek where it joined the slow, unhurried current. Thomas watched the fire flicker and dance in the hearth, its flames casting gentle light across the walls and stretching shadows into the corners of the cabin. The rain outside continued its steady rhythm, pattering softly against the roof, slipping down the windows in thin, shimmering lines. He stood for a moment longer, feeling the warmth of the flames on his hands before turning back to the rocking chair, the wooden frame creaking softly as he settled back into it. He reached for the book he had left on the small wooden table beside him, its leather cover worn and familiar beneath his fingertips. He opened it slowly, the pages whispering as they turned, releasing the faint scent of old paper. He ran his hand over the first page, smoothing it gently before leaning back into the chair, his eyes tracing the familiar lines of text. Outside, the rain drummed gently, unbroken and constant, a soft backdrop to the silence that filled the cabin. He rocked slowly, the chair creaking in time with the rhythm of the rain, his gaze fixed on the words before him. The story unfolded with the slow, deliberate pace of something long remembered, each sentence stretching out into the stillness, filling the space with quiet purpose. The fire crackled softly, sending faint sparks spiralling up the chimney, their light catching momentarily before disappearing into the shadows above. Thomas turned the pages carefully, his eyes moving steadily over the text, pausing now and then to listen to the rain as it tapped against the window pane. It was heavier now, slipping from the eaves in long, unbroken streams, pooling along the edge of the porch before spilling over and winding its way down the path. The hours passed gently, unhurried, the rain drumming its steady rhythm against the roof as Thomas read, his hands cradling the book, his gaze steady and calm. He lost track of time in the way one does when the world outside is hidden behind a curtain of rain, the cabin warm and still, untouched by the pull of the hours. The fire burned lower, its flames settling into soft glowing embers that pulsed faintly in the grate. The lanterns flickered, their light stretching across the room, sending long shadows dancing along the wooden floorboards. Thomas glanced up from his book, blinking slowly as his eyes adjusted to the shift stretching his arms over his head and feeling the comfortable ache of stillness settle into his bones. The rain had grown heavier, drumming more insistently against the windows, blurring the view outside into soft patches of grey and green. He moved toward the window, brushing the curtain aside and peering out into the darkness. The trees swayed slightly under the weight of the rain, their branches heavy with droplets that shimmered in the faint light. Puddles had gathered along the path, their surfaces rippling gently with each new drop that slipped from the roof. Satisfied, Thomas let the curtain fall back into place, its thick fabric muffling the sound slightly, but never quite silencing it. He moved slowly through the cabin, his hands brushing along the backs of chairs, fingertips grazing the smooth grain of the wooden shelves that lined the walls. He reached the lanterns, turning the knobs gently to lower the flames, their light dimming until they flickered out, leaving the room cast in the soft, steady glow of the fire. The clock on the wall ticked quietly, its hands moving with slow precision, marking the passage of time with a soft, rhythmic whisper. Thomas moved to the hearth, stirred the embers with the iron poker, and added one last log, nudging it carefully into place before setting the screen back across the grate. The flames crackled softly, catching at the bark and sending faint spirals of smoke curling up toward the chimney. He moved to the small washstand near the corner of the room, the wooden basin resting on its surface filled with fresh water, had brought in that morning. He splashed his face with it, the coolness spreading over his skin, brushing away the last traces of sleepiness that clung to him. He wiped his face with the cloth that hung beside the basin, its surface soft and familiar, worn thin at the edges. Thomas unbuttoned his shirt slowly, his hands moving with practiced ease, the fabric slipping from his shoulders before he folded it neatly and set it on the back of the chair. He pulled on the soft flannel shirt that hung on the hook near the bed, its edges frayed from years of wear, the fabric soft and warm. He reached down, pulling back the heavy quilt that covered the small bed tucked against the far wall. The mattress creaked softly as he sat down, the springs settling beneath his weight. He reached over to the nightstand, where a single oil lamp sat, its light stretching out in long, gentle lines across the walls. He turned the knob slowly, the flame flickering once before going out, the room falling into the soft glow of the firelight. He pulled the quilt up over his shoulders, tucking it in around him, the weight of it familiar and comforting. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm, slipping from the eaves and pooling along the path, winding its way down the slope toward the creek. He listened to it, his eyes growing heavy as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, its light flickering against the ceiling in gentle patterns. The room grew still, wrapped in the warmth of the fire and the steady whisper of rain. Thomas closed his eyes, his breathing settling into a slow, steady rhythm that matched the rain's unhurried pace. Outside, the mist crept through the trees, slipping between branches, curling along the forest floor. He drifted off slowly, the edges of sleep slipping over him like the soft weight of a blanket, pulling him gently under. The rain continued, its rhythm unbroken, stretching out across the night, unhurried and constant. The fire crackled softly, sending faint trails of smoke curling up towards the chimney, the room settling into stillness as Thomas slept, the rain tapping gently on the roof above. The rain still fell softly against the roof when Thomas woke the next morning, its steady rhythm stretching out across the early light. He lay still for a moment beneath the heavy quilt, listening, as droplets tapped gently on the shingles, slipping down the eaves in thin, winding streams. Outside, the world was muffled and blurred, the forest hidden beneath a fine curtain of mist that wound its way between the trunks of the pines. He stretched his arms slowly, feeling the comfortable pull of sleep loosen its grip on his bones. The cabin was cool, the fire in the hearth now only faint embers, their glow barely visible, fine grey ash. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet touching the smooth wooden floor, cool and familiar beneath him. The room was dim, the light softened by the rain that trailed down the windows in uneven lines. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and pulled on his flannel shirt, buttoning it slowly before stepping to the stove. His hands moved with the ease of long familiarity as he added kindling to the ashes, stacking it carefully before reaching for 2 thick logs from the pile near the hearth. The fire caught quickly, crackling softly as the flames curled around the bark, sending thin trails of smoke spiralling up the chimney. He stirred it with the iron poker, nudging the logs into place, listening as the warmth began to spread through the room, chasing away the last remnants of the morning chill. Thomas moved unhurriedly to the window, his hand resting on the edge of the frame as he peered out into the rain. The path that led to the creek was slick with water, small streams winding their way down the stones, pooling at the edges where the earth dipped. The mist hung low, weaving between the branches, blurring the outlines of the trees into soft patches of green and grey. He watched for a moment longer, his gaze tracing the path of droplets as they slipped from the tips of branches, landing with soft splashes in the puddles below. The rain showed no sign of stopping, its rhythm steady and unbroken, stretching out as far as he could see. Satisfied, Thomas turned back to the kitchen, reaching for the iron kettle that hung from the hook beside the stove. He filled it from the rain barrel outside, the water splashing softly against the sides as he carried it back inside. It was cool and fresh, the surface shimmering with tiny ripples that caught the light from the fire. He set it on the stove and waited as it began to steam, thin trails of vapour curling up and fogging the window behind it. While the water heated, he busied himself with small tasks, his hands moving slowly and deliberately. He straightened them, wooden chairs by the table, brushing away bits of dust that had gathered along the backs. He wiped the countertop clean, his hand moving in smooth practice circles, the damp cloth leaving faint trails that vanished moments later. The rain continued to drum gently against the roof, its rhythm constant and calming. He listened to it as he worked, pausing now and then to watch as droplets slipped down the window pane, merging and splitting before disappearing out of sight. The light outside remained dim, the mist growing thicker, curling around the cabin like a soft grey shroud. When the water finally came to a rolling boil, he poured it into a basin, setting it on the counter to cool. He rinsed his hands in the fresh water, splashing his face and feeling the coolness spread across his skin, chasing away the last remnants of sleep. He dried his hands carefully, hanging the cloth back on its hook with a neatness that spoke of habit rather than need. Thomas moved back to the fire, stirring it gently, adding another log, and watching as the flames licked eagerly at the bark, curling around the edges and sending thin tendrils of smoke spiralling up. The warmth spread slowly through the cabin, brushing away the damp chill that lingered in the corners, filling the room with the familiar scent of cedar and ash. Outside, the rain continued, unhurried and constant, a soft whisper that wove through the stillness of the trees. Thomas pulled on his boots, their leather cool and stiff, and shrugged into his coat, the heavy fabric settling around his shoulders with comforting weight. He wrapped a scarf around his neck, knotting it twice before reaching for his hat, pulling it low over his brow. The door creaked softly as he pulled it open, the hinges groaning faintly with the dampness. He stepped out onto the porch, his boots thudding softly against the wooden boards, slick with rain. The air was sharp and clean, heavy with the scent of wet pine and damp earth. Mist hung low over the path, curling along the edges of the stones, slipping between the roots of the trees that stretched up from the forest floor. He stood for a moment, breathing in deeply, feeling the coolness settle into his lungs. The key, rain slipped from the edges of the roof, pooling along the edge of the porch before spilling over in soft rivulets that wound their way toward the creek. The steady rhythm of it filled the silence, smoothing away the roughness of the world, softening its edges. Thomas stepped down from the porch, his boots leaving faint impressions in the mud as he moved toward the small wood pile that sat beneath the overhang. The logs were stacked neatly, their surfaces damp from the mist, but dry beneath the tarp he had thrown over them the week before. He reached for a few of the larger ones, stacking them carefully in his arms, before turning back to the cabin. The door swung open with a soft creak as he stepped inside, the warmth of the fire brushing against his cheeks, chasing away the damp chill that had settled into his coat. He set the logs beside the hearth, brushing his hands against his trousers, bits of bark and dust scattering to the floor. He pulled off his coat, hung it back on its peg beside the door, and moved to the stove, adding a bit more kindling to the flames. The fire crackled eagerly, its warmth spreading out in gentle waves, filling the cabin with the scent of cedar and smoke. Thomas straightened the chairs by the table, ran his hand along the edge of the counter, and paused for a moment, his hand resting on the back of the rocking chair near the fire. Outside, the rain continued, soft and steady, slipping from branch to branch, winding its way along the forest floor in slow, meandering streams. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting warm light across the wooden beams of the cabin and stretching shadows along the floor. The rain continued its steady descent, tapping gently against the windows, slipping down the glass in winding, silvery trails. Thomas stood for a moment near the fire, his hands resting on the back of the rocking chair as he listened to the soft, unbroken rhythm of the rain. The cabin was still, wrapped in the hush that always accompanied long stretches of rain. Past the air was warm and fragrant, with the scent of cedar and smoke, softened by the faint whisper of mist that crept through the trees outside. Thomas took a slow breath, feeling the warmth settle deep into his chest before he pushed back the sleeves of his shirt and set about his morning routine. He moved first to the small wooden shelves that lined the far wall, their surfaces cluttered with jars of herbs and neatly stacked tins. His hands moved with familiar precision as he straightened the rows, his fingertips brushing the glass as he adjusted each one into place. Dried lavender and bundles of rosemary hung from hooks just above, their scents mingling faintly in the air as he brushed against them. A fine layer of dust had settled on the lower shelves, thin and soft beneath his fingertips. He reached for the cloth that hung from the peg near the door, dampened it slightly with water from the basin, movements were slow and methodical, his hand moving in smooth, circular patterns as he brushed the dust away. The cloth grew darker with each pass, gathering the remnants of weeks spent by the open window, the fine particles carried in by the wind and the rain. Outside, the rain slipped from the edges of the roof in thin rivulets, pooling in shallow puddles that rippled with each new drop. Thomas paused for a moment, watching as droplets traced paths down the window pane, merging and splitting before trailing off into nothing. The view beyond was softened by mist, the trees reduced to patches of grey and green, their outlines blurred by the unbroken curtain of rain. Satisfied with the shelves, he moved to the workbench by the window, its surface scattered with bits of twine, tools and small wooden projects in various states of completion. He brushed away the sawdust that had gathered in the corners, his hands sweeping the fine curls of wood into his palm before dropping them into the small metal bin beside the bench. There was a drawer beneath the workbench, its handle worn smooth from years of use. He pulled it open, revealing neat rows of nails, screws and bits of wire, each nestled in its own compartment. He ran his hand along the edges, straightening the contents, his fingertips brushing over the cool metal before he slid the drawer shut with a soft thud. A small wooden box sat at the corner of the workbench, its edges sanded smooth, the lid hinged neatly along one side. Thomas picked it up, turning it over in his hands, feeling the weight of it settle against his palms. It was a project he had started a week or so ago, carving it slowly in the evenings as the rain tapped against the windows and the fire burned low in the hearth. He ran his thumb along the edges, feeling for rough patches that still needed smoothing. The grain of the wood was soft beneath his hands, its surface polished from handling. He reached for the block of sandpaper that sat on the edge of the bench, its surface rough and worn, and began to work it gently over the edges of the box. The motion was slow and deliberate, each pass of the sandpaper smoothing away the faintest imperfections, turning the corners soft and even. He watched as fine curls of wood dust slipped to the floor, gathering in faint piles at his feet. Outside, the rain continued, its rhythm unchanging, steady and unhurried. Thomas paused now and then to brush away the dust, his fingertips moving over the wood to feel for snags or roughness. The work was soothing, his hands moving in familiar patterns, his mind settling into the gentle rhythm of it. He turned the box in his hands, smoothing the bottom and the lid, running his thumb along the edge where the two pieces met to ensure they fit snugly. When he was satisfied, he set the sandpaper aside and reached for the small tin of wood oil that sat on the shelf above the workbench. He unscrewed the lid, the faint scent of pine and cedar wafting up as he dipped a clean cloth into the oil. He worked it into the surface of the wood with slow circular motions, watching as the grain deepened and grew richer beneath his touch. The rain tapped softly against the window, its rhythm steady and constant, a gentle percussion that filled the silence of the cabin. Thomas leaned over the workbench, his hands moving in unhurried circles, the wood drinking in the oil and gleaming faintly in the soft light of the room. He wiped away the excess with a clean cloth, polishing the surface until it shone with a soft, even glow. He set the box aside to dry, his fingertips brushing gently along the edge before moving back to the workbench to tidy up. The tool across the stones of the path, slipping into shallow puddles that rippled with each new drop. The mist hung low, weaving between the trunks of the trees, curling around the branches like a living thing. He stood for a moment, hands resting on the edge of the workbench, his gaze steady as he watched the rain slip down the glass. There was a stillness to it, a kind of soft suspension that held the world in quiet pause, blurring the edges of the forest and turning the landscape into a gentle wash of green and grey. Thomas stood by the workbench for a while longer, his hands resting on its smooth, polished surface, the smell of freshly oiled wood lingering in the air. Outside, the rain drummed a soft, unbroken rhythm against the roof, slipping from the edges in thin, silver trails. The mist wove between the trunks of the trees, blurring the edges of the forest, softening it into gentle patches of grey and green. After a few moments, he straightened up, dusting the remnants of sawdust from his hands, and looked around the cabin with a quiet, reflective gaze. The shelves that lined the far wall were stacked neatly with jars and tins, each one labelled in his careful handwriting. But there were a few things out of place. Bundles of dried herbs had shifted. A row of glass jars had been nudged slightly off-centre, and a stray bit of twine had unravelled from its coil. He moved to the shelves, his footsteps soft against the wooden floor, the fire crackling gently behind him. The light from the windows was muted, filtered through the rain that streaked the glass in winding trails. He reached for the jars first, his hands steady as he adjusted each one, lining them up neatly along the back edge of the shelf. His fingertips brushed against the glass, the coolness familiar and smooth. The bundles of herbs hung from small hooks just above the shelves, their stems tied with bits of twine, their leaves brittle and fragrant. Lavender, rosemary and sage hung in tidy rows, their colours faded but still vibrant in scent. He straightened them gently, his hands brushing over the dry stems, releasing faint hints of their fragrance into the room. The stray bit of twine was coiled neatly and set back on its hook, the loose end tucked in tightly to keep it from unravelling again. Thomas stepped back, surveying the shelves with a nod of quiet satisfaction. Everything was back in its place, each item aligned with familiar precision. The rain continued its steady patter, filling the silence with its soft, rhythmic percussion. He listened to it for a moment, his gaze drifting to the window, where droplets traced slow paths down the glass, merging and splitting before pooling at the bottom. The light outside had grown softer, the mist thickening, winding through the trees like a living thing. Thomas turned his attention to the far corner of the cabin, where an old wooden chair sat beside the small kitchen table. Its legs were sturdy, but one of them creaked faintly whenever he leaned back in it, a soft, groaning sound that had grown more pronounced over the past few weeks. He moved toward it, running his hand over the backrest, feeling the smoothness of the wood beneath his fingertips. He lifted the chair gently, turning it upside down and setting it carefully on the workbench. Its legs jutted upward, their edges worn smooth from years of use. He reached for the drawer beneath the bench, pulling it open with a soft scrape of wood against wood. Inside, tools were arranged neatly: screwdrivers, bits of sandpaper, small tins of oil and polish. Thomas took out a screwdriver, the metal cool and familiar in his hand, and knelt beside the chair. He ran his hand along the joints, feeling for looseness, his just enough to send a soft creak echoing through the room when weight was applied. He worked patiently, unhurried, the sound of the rain a steady backdrop to the soft scratch of metal against wood. He tightened the screws that held the leg in place, adding a dab of wood glue for good measure. His hands moved with practiced ease, each turn of the screwdriver deliberate and slow. When the joint was secure, he ran his hand over the edges, feeling for roughness. A small splinter jutted from the back leg, its edge sharp and uneven. Thomas reached for the sandpaper on the edge of the bench, its surface rough beneath his fingertips, and began to smooth the wood with slow, careful strokes. Fine curls of dust drifted to the floor, gathering in small piles as he worked, his movements rhythmic and unhurried. He paused now and then to brush the dust away, his hands steady and methodical. Outside, the rain continued, its rhythm unbroken, slipping from the eaves in long, winding streams that pooled along the path. Mist curled through the trees, softening their outlines, turning the forest into a watercolour of muted greens and greys. When he was satisfied, Thomas set the sandpaper aside and brushed his hands off on his trousers, sending fine clouds of dust into the air. He lifted the chair carefully, turning it back onto its legs, and set it gently beside the table. He leaned his weight into it, pressing down slowly and listening for the creak that had so often followed. The wood held firm, silent, and steady. He nodded with quiet satisfaction, his hand resting on the back of the chair for a moment before he stepped back. The rain pattered softly against the window, its rhythm constant and unchanging. He watched as droplets traced paths down the glass, slipping over the uneven surface before disappearing from view. Thomas moved to the small stack of firewood beside the hearth, straightening the logs and brushing away the bits of bark that had gathered on the floor. He swept the area gently, his hand steady on the broom as he cleared away the fine layer of dust and wood chips that had collected near the base of the stone hearth. The fire crackled softly, sending faint trails of smoke spiralling up the chimney, filling the cabin with warmth and the familiar scent of cedar and ash. He watched as the flames licked at the edges of the logs, curling around the bark and sending tiny sparks spiraling upward. Satisfied with his work, Thomas stepped back, his hands resting on his hips as he surveyed the room. The shelves were neat and orderly, the chair mended and sturdy, the floor swept clean of dust and wood chips. The cabin felt warm and still, the fire casting long shadows along the walls, the rain tapping gently against the windows. Thomas stepped back from the hearth, brushing his hands absently against his trousers, the faint scent of cedar and ash clinging to his fingertips. The cabin was neat and orderly, its shelves straightened, the floors swept, and the chair near the kitchen table now sturdy and silent. Outside, the rain continued its steady descent, drumming softly on the roof and slipping from the eaves in long, unbroken streams. He paused by the window, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the wooden frame as he peered out into the mist-shrouded forest. The rain streaked the glass in delicate, meandering lines, gathering in fat droplets that shimmered for a moment before slipping away. The world beyond was blurred and softened. The trees stretched tall and thin, their outlines muted by the mist that wound its way through the underbrush. Patches of green peeked out from beneath the grey, leaves heavy with moisture, trembling slightly as drops collected along their edges. Puddles had formed along the winding path, their surfaces rippling the stillness. The mist hung low, creeping between the trunks, curling around the base of the pines, like breath on a cold morning. Thomas watched for a long while, his gaze following the slow, unhurried paths the droplets made as they slipped down the window pane. He traced one with his finger, feeling the coolness of the glass beneath his touch, watching as it merged with another and grew heavier, his path quickening before disappearing out of sight. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm, unbroken and constant, filling the silence with its gentle percussion. He listened to it, letting the sound wash over him, soft and unhurried. There was a peace in it, a kind of rhythm that smoothed the edges of thought, stretching the minutes out into long, unbroken lines. Eventually, he stepped back from the window, his hand slipping from the frame as he moved toward the fire. The flames had settled into a gentle crackle, the logs burning steadily, their edges blackened and split with thin lines of ember. He reached for the iron poker, nudging the wood into place, stirring the coals until they glowed brighter, sending thin trails of smoke curling up the chimney. Satisfied, Thomas straightened up, stretching his arms slowly, feeling the pull of the day in his shoulders. The room was warm and quiet, the light from the fire stretching across the wooden floorboards in long, flickering patterns. He moved to the rocking chair by the hearth, its wooden frame creaking softly as he settled into it, the familiar weight of the seat welcoming him back. The woolen blanket he had folded earlier lay draped over the back of the chair. He pulled it over his lap, tucking it in around his legs, the fabric soft and thick, worn from years of use. Outside, the rain continued its unhurried rhythm, slipping from leaf to leaf, pooling in shallow puddles that rippled with each new drop. Thomas leaned back in the chair, his hands resting comfortably on the worn wooden arms, his gaze drifting back to the window where the rain still traced paths down the glass. He rocked gently, the chair moving back and forth with a soft, rhythmic creak, the sound blending with the crackle of the fire and the patter of rain. Time moved slowly in the cabin, stretching out with the soft rise and fall of the fire, the whisper of rain against the roof, the distant sigh of wind that slipped through the trees. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the world settle around him, feeling the familiar stillness of the place take hold. He thought of the days before the rain had come, when the ground had been dry and firm beneath his boots, the leaves crisp and rustling with each step. Now the earth was softened, the path turned to mud, the stones slick with moss and rainwater. The forest seemed to breathe under the weight of it, branches bending, roots drinking deeply from the softened soil. The fire crackled softly beside him, sending faint sparks spiralling up the chimney. Thomas reached out and picked up the book he had left on the small wooden table beside the chair. Its cover was worn and smooth, the edges softened by years of gentle handling. He turned it over in his hands for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of it, the leather binding cool and comforting beneath his fingertips. He opened it slowly, the pages whispering as they turned, releasing the faint scent of old paper and dust. He settled back into the chair, pulling the blanket tighter around his legs, and began to read. His eyes moved steadily over the spaces between the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind that brushed against the windows. The light outside had dimmed further, fading into a soft silvery grey that hovered just above the trees. The rain remained steady, falling in delicate sheets that blurred the forest into dreamlike layers of shadow and green. The firelight flickered across the cabin walls, steady and golden, its warmth filling the room in gentle waves. Thomas sat quietly for a moment longer, eyes still closed, the steady creak of the rocking chair matching the cadence of the rain. Then he stirred, stretching, his arms slowly and letting the blanket slip from his lap. The room was growing darker now, the corners softening into shadow, the windows dulled by the mist outside. He stood from the chair, moving with the slow, even grace of someone entirely unhurried. The book was returned to the table, its worn cover resting beside the wooden lamp. He reached for the oil lantern and adjusted the wick slightly, the flame brightening just enough to stretch across the table and kitchen counter, casting a soft glow that mingled with the fading light of the fire. In the small kitchen nook, he stood quietly for a moment, surveying the pantry shelves. He didn't need much, just something simple to warm and satisfy. He took a small clay crock of leftover stew from the cool pantry cabinet and set it on the stove. The fire beneath the iron surface had dimmed, so he added a split log and a handful of kindling. The flames caught quickly, licking up through the gaps in the wood, sending a fresh burst of warmth into the space. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, rustling through the trees, sending scattered bursts of rain against the window panes with a gentle rattle. Thomas stirred the stew slowly as it warmed, the scent of thyme and barley lifting into the air again, mingling with the earthy perfume of damp pine carried in through the cracks of the old cabin. He sliced a piece of the remaining bread from the loaf on the counter, its crust now a bit firmer, the inside still soft, and placed it on a plate. As the stew simmered, he moved about the kitchen, tidying here and there. He wiped down the countertop with a damp cloth, swept up the fine trail of flour he'd missed the day before, and retied the loose twine around a hanging bundle of sage that had sagged slightly from its hook. These were the kinds of tasks that didn't demand attention, but felt quietly necessary, grounding. Each motion, small, gentle, and familiar. He ladled the steaming stew into a wooden bowl and carried it to the small table near the hearth. Bubson Drimnars, chair he had repaired earlier, sat solid and true beneath him, the soft creak now gone, replaced by a grounded stillness. He dipped his bread into the broth and ate slowly, listening to the rain as it traced soft paths across the roof and windows. There was no urgency. The day was winding down at its own pace, the rain offering its steady soundtrack, the fire's glow pressing gently outward against the gathering night. He finished his meal quietly, wiping the edge of the bowl with the last bite of bread before setting the dishes in the basin. He filled a small kettle with warm water from the stove and rinsed them one by one, stacking them neatly to dry on the folded cloth beside the sink. Then he moved through the cabin again, this time a bit more slowly, checking that all was in place for the evening. The windows were sealed against the breeze, the wood stacked for the night, the tools returned to their pegs. He folded the blanket he'd left draped over the chair, laid it across the backrest, and adjusted the pillows on the bed tucked against the far wall. The room was clean now, warm and still, filled with the low flicker of firelight and the soft whisper of rain slipping from leaf to leaf outside. drawing the curtain aside. The night had fully taken hold of the forest. Mist curled like smoke through the trees, the rain falling in soft silken threads through the branches. No wind now, just stillness, the hush of a world wrapped in water and shadow. He let the curtain fall back into place and turned slowly toward the bed. The quilt lay folded down just as he'd left it. The flannel shirt he had worn all day was hung on its peg, pulled on a clean one from the chest near the foot of the bed, the fabric soft and cool against his skin. He extinguished the lantern beside the window and stood for a moment in the quiet, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light of the fire. Then he climbed into bed, pulling the heavy quilt over his chest, the weight of it a familiar comfort. The fire murmured quietly from the hearth, its light ebbing and flowing across the walls. The rain, steady as ever, whispered on the roof. Thomas laid still, his arms resting over the quilt, his breath matching the quiet rhythm of the world around him. He stared at the ceiling beams, faintly outlined in the fire's glow, his mind emptying of the day's small tasks and filled only with the gentle hush of the night. He blinked slowly, then let his eyes stay closed. The fire settled into a soft, glowing pulse. The rain continued to fall. The morning came slowly, wrapped in the same grey stillness as the day before. Rain whispered on the roof in a soft, even rhythm, and the light that filtered into the cabin through the curtained windows was dim and diffuse, less a sunrise than a quiet shifting of shadow. Thomas stirred beneath the heavy quilt, the warmth of sleep still clinging to his limbs. For a moment, he simply listened, eyes still closed, body still, taking in the gentle percussion of water on wood, the muted crackle of the hearth's last embers, and the faint creak of the rafters settling with the cool, damp air. When he opened his eyes, the ceiling beams were barely visible in the pale glow cast by the low fire. He reached an arm out from under the quilt, stretching slowly, fingers splayed, as if to feel the softness of the cabin air. He breathed in deeply, the scent of damp pine, wood smoke, and something faintly mineral, like wet stone. He sat up slowly, the mattress beneath him giving a familiar groan. His feet met the wooden floor with a gentle thud, cool against his soles. For a while, he didn't move. He simply sat there, his hands resting loosely on his thighs, watching the soft orange pulse of the embers in the hearth. After a few minutes, he reached for the folded flannel shirt hanging neatly on the peg by the bed and pulled it on over his shoulders. The fabric was cool but dry, worn soft at the collar and cuffs. He stood, rolling his shoulders to work out the stiffness of the night. The fire had burned low, little more than a cradle of glowing coals nestled in ash. Thomas knelt beside the hearth and added 2 dry logs from the stack. They settled into place with a muted thump. He nudged them into the embers with the poker, watching as thin orange tongues of flame flickered to life, licking at the dry bark, smoke curling gently upward. Outside, the rain persisted, a steady hush on the roof, a constant background like breath, alive and patient. He moved to the window and drew the curtain aside. The forest beyond looked unchanged Thomas stood at the window for a while, one hand braced on the sill, the other resting lightly at his side. There was no need to rush. The day would unfold the way the last had, quietly, steadily, shaped by small tasks and soft sounds. Eventually, he moved to the small kitchen nook and filled the kettle again with cool water from the pitcher. He set it on the stove and struck a match, the blue flame flickering softly beneath the iron. He wouldn't make tea this morning. He'd had enough the day before, but the warm water would be good for washing and wiping down the cabin surfaces, something he found oddly satisfying in weather like this. While the kettle began to warm, he pulled open the top drawer of the work table and took out a clean cloth. The drawer was neatly organised, filled with the little bundles of folded linens, spools of thread and simple tools. He tipped the cloth into the basin and wrung it out slowly, then moved to the table near the window. He wiped it down in slow, even strokes, removing the fine layer of dust that had returned overnight. The cloth made no sound, but left behind a faint trail of dampness that quickly vanished into the wood. He moved methodically from the table to the shelves, the cabinet doors, the top of the washstand. Each surface responded to his touch, quietly giving way to cleanliness, leaving behind the bare scent of water and pine oil. These weren't chores, in the usual sense. They were rituals, gentle repetitions, ways to shape the time, to keep his hands busy while his thoughts moved like the mist outside, drifting slowly, touching everything, then disappearing. The kettle hissed softly, the lid beginning to rattle. He removed it from the heat before it could whistle, and poured the hot water into a second basin, adding a few drops of soap from the small crock on the windowsill. He used it to rinse the cloth, then continued with his slow, even cleaning. Later, in the morning, he moved to the small cabinet near the door where his mending things were kept. A wool sock had developed a small hole at the heel, and the edge of one of his sleeves had frayed slightly. He took them out and set them neatly on the table, alongside a wooden darning mushroom and a tin of thread. He worked with slow hands, threading the needle carefully, his fingers steady. The rain tapped softly at the windows. The fire crackled, low. There was no sound beyond those. Thread passed through wool. The fabric pulled gently. The sock turned in his hands as he patched the worn spot, each stitch placed with quiet care. He tied off the thread, examined the seam, then moved on to the sleeve. A single loose stitch just near the cuff. He fixed it in a few deliberate passes of the needle. By midday, the fire was strong again, glowing gently behind the screen. The cabin was warmer now, filled with the mingled scents of damp wood, smouldering cedar, and wool warmed by the hearth. Thomas folded the mended clothes and placed them back in the small wooden chest near the bed. Then he sat in the rocking chair by the fire, his hands resting lightly on the arms, the repaired sock still warm in his lap. He didn't rock. He didn't speak. He simply sat and listened to the rain. Thomas remained in the rocking chair for some time, the patched sock resting lightly in his lap, his gaze unfocused, watching the fire more with his ears than his eyes. The flames were low now, subdued, content to smoulder and offer warmth without spectacle. Outside, the rain fell with the same familiar cadence, soft, steady, unbothered by time. He eventually set the sock aside and stood, his knees creaking quietly, a subtle reminder of the hours spent at quiet work. The afternoon light, such as it was, began to shift, edges duller. Evening wasn't far, though it approached without hurry, blending gradually with the quiet tone of the day. There was no need for a large meal, just something small and warm to mark the end of the day. Thomas sliced a few pieces of root vegetables, what remained of the carrots and a single potato, and dropped them into a small pot with the last of the broth he'd kept aside from the stew. The fire was still hot enough for a gentle simmer, and as the pot warmed, the scent of thyme and earth filled the cabin again, mild and grounding. He didn't rush the cooking. There was no point. He stirred it occasionally, savouring the quiet sound of the spoon tapping against the pot, the smell of the broth deepening as the vegetables softened. The warmth of the stove was comforting in its simplicity, the kind of heat that seeps into the floorboards and slows everything down. When the soup was ready, Thomas carried the bowl to the table near the fire and ate without sound or ceremony. Each spoonful was slow, the taste familiar, the meal more of a gesture than a need. He wasn't hungry in the way people are in busy places. He was only maintaining a rhythm, a way to close the loop of the day with softness. Once finished, he rinsed the bowl and wiped it dry. He returned it to the shelf, smoothing the cloth beneath it as though there might be a visitor to see. There would be none, but it didn't matter. Order was its own comfort. The light outside had dimmed, nearly to dusk now. The forest beyond the cabin had vanished into a slow-moving fog, trees softened to shapes, the path erased by water and shadow. Rain continued, never loud, never still, just there, as it had been. Thomas moved quietly through the room, folding the cloth he'd used earlier, adjusting the books on the shelf by a fraction, and checking the latch on the back window. The cabin didn't need these final touches, but he did. These small acts of care, of attention, were his way of saying good night to the space that had carried him gently through the days of rain. At last, he added a final log to the hearth, not a large one, just enough to give warmth for the last stretch of the evening. The fire accepted it gratefully, the flames curling around the bark with soft intention. He drew the curtains closed, one by one, moving from window to window. The lantern stayed dark this time. The fire was enough. He changed into a dry shirt, folded the day's clothes, and placed them on the cedar chest. The bed looked just as it had the night before, quilt folded halfway down, pillow waiting. Thomas sat at the edge of the bed for a moment, hands resting